Hello and welcome to the E46 M3 GTR setup video. If all you're after is the setup sheets, feel free, head off to the last minute or so of the video. You'll find the setup sheets there in both rates and units, depending on how you work. We get it, sometimes you just need to set up, it's fine. For those that want the detail, the usual format is coming up, which is going to go through the car itself, which involves how the default setup felt, what we felt needed work, and what the car was like to work with in general. We'll go through any things we found a little bit strange about the car, and then what the development work actually involved, which circuits it's been tested at. We'll then go through the car setup itself and any suggested adjustments to make if you feel the need, and then finally into what's next up, and then into the setup sheets themselves. So, without further ado, let's get into the car. So the car itself, I came to this car really wanting to love it, and I was truly optimistic off the back of the E30 Group A M3 experience, because I absolutely loved driving that car and I really can't wait to get back to it. Sadly, the E46 here didn't continue that positivity for me. So at first the default setup didn't feel all that bad really, but it had some strangeness going on. It had an instability at the rear. It was right at the apex and you just couldn't really lean on it. And then when you then went to get on the throttle, even if you'd got the rear fully settled, when you went to get on the throttle, it just wasn't stable. It would just break away at the moment where you least needed it to. And even if you were being kind to it, it's still just you can never really trust it. And it felt like the two ends of the car were working separately to each other. They weren't in harmony. It wasn't a balanced car. And it felt generally too stiff, and not just in the suspension, but not in the damping either, but in suspension, damping, and also chassis. It feels like it's got a really overly stiff chassis, and it doesn't behave particularly nicely. It also, as a result of all this, had a tendency to lock and snatch the inside front wheel under braking, and then had an occasional tendency to lock and snatch the rear as well under brakes. And I think that possibly is a symptom of what felt like an overall stiffness issue or a compliance issue. So now, well, it's worth saying though, that sounds really bad and it sounds really, really negative, but it didn't do anything terribly. It wasn't awful. It was there, and when I first drove it, it felt like everything was sort of like, just a few clicks away from being sorted. It was one of those ones, it was like, oh, it's doing this, I don't like that, that's a bit strange, but we can get that sorted out, no worries. It was one of those sort of situations. But the further I got into it, it just wasn't the case. So the longer I spent developing that default setup, the more it became crystal clear that its ceiling of development was actually quite low. And then it became really clear that this was going to be a very difficult car to get right, which is why it's been such a long time between these videos, and also why you haven't really seen any races either for it. So yeah, this one's been a real challenge, and it's got some strangeness, but rather than strangeness, let's call them points of note. It's got some points of note, so let's get into those now. So first thing, let's not start off on the negative bits. Let's just start with the generic stuff. So for this car, you've got 3 dry, slick compounds. You've got soft, medium, and hard. And you will need to get used to choosing which one is suitable for the different conditions. Also worth mentioning that even if you're using a 2-pedal auto clutch stroke auto blip setup, a quick blip of the throttle on downshift, especially for the lower gears, is probably advisable to help balance the car out on the brakes and help stop that rear end locking. It's also got available to you for adjustment the diff, power and coast ramps. Now, in real life, you wouldn't have the adjustment levels you've got here. So in the game, you can go up in degree increments. Now, in real life, you would have, say, 25 degrees, 30 degrees, 35, 45, 55, 65, 75 and 90 degrees. But also, you wouldn't have full independence on which ones you had for coast and for power. You would have certain combinations of those degrees available to you. Now, in most cases, you would have equal power and coast for each of those combinations, or you would have, say, a 30-degree power and a 65-degree coast, or vice versa. You know, you would have it so that you only had certain combinations you could use. In the game, we're spoiled. Now, use it because you will need to, but for the setup, we've given it a rounded number because in real life, that's kind of what you would have available to you. So I've put a link in the description of a PDF file for the Quaife clutch differential. And one of the last pages there shows you the different combinations which are available. So if you want to keep it authentic, have a look at that PDF and you'll be able to see what combinations are available. And I'll mark the page number on the link, the text around the link as well, just so you can get there straight away. So, right, let's get into the car. So it feels like it's got some background things going on, and I believe really it needs looking into in greater detail at Reiza's end, I think. So, caveat as well, while this new setup really helps the car in all areas and in the braking stability issues, they are still present and I can't get rid of them. Well, sorry, I should rephrase that. We have not been able to get rid of them. Quite where the issues lay is difficult to say, but they manifest themselves in front locking mainly, and this prevents you from being able to fully utilise the braking power of the car. So you're never really able to use 100% brakes. It's a very difficult car to drive consistently. You have to baby it most of the time, and you've got to be very, very mindful with how you push it, because it doesn't like being pushed. You have to almost drive within yours and its limits and ensure that you don't cross that line. So, as I said earlier, it feels very much like the chassis is overly stiff. It has traits of an overly stiff chassis, which includes a very, very small setup window, and it's going to be very, very difficult to get this car working over changing conditions. It's not ideal for an endurance car. Yeah, it isn't great in that respect. It has very little compliance, which again could be related to what feels like an overly stiff chassis. And it, just to say, it may not be anything to do with the chassis, but this is how it's manifesting itself. This is how it feels to me. So it also uses its tyres very poorly as well. So as an example, I took it to modern day Kyalami, default date 3 o'clock in the afternoon it was, track temperature of 43 degrees, hard slick tyres because mediums just cooked themselves, and I could even overheat the hards without pushing it. I was driving sensitively. I was being sensible, kind, minimal slip and slide. Well, sorry, minimal slip and virtually no slide. And I could run right on the edge of what the hard tyres could cope with in terms of their temperature range. But the temperature on the HUD was around about 95. Now the hard tyres, they're in their element around that sort of temperature, in their core temperature. What I can't see is the surface temperature, and I suspect that the surface is melting, cooking, and then getting very, very slippy and sloppy, and that's how it feels. It feels like it's cooking the surface of the tyre, and then it's just running on this gum, if you like, and it loses its grip and its edge, and then once you get to that point, you're in real trouble, and there's very little you can do about it. It will break away very, very easily. It has a very, very low peak grip level, and it almost just feels like it sort of goes up a little bit and then it just loses and goes away. And even on the hard tyre, it was doing that. Now, if it was a 60-degree track temperature, I would go, you know what, okay, I can understand that. But at 43, no way should that tyre behave in that way. There's something going on that's outside of my control, and I was absolutely babying that car at the time. Example number 2 was Hockenheim GP, not this race, but another race. It was 36 degrees track temperature, and I was on the medium slicks, and again I had to baby the medium slicks. And similar thing, they got to the early 90s in temperature and then reached that gummy feel, and then that was, yeah, it's very, very difficult, very awkward. You have to manage it, really. Could it be track dependent? I don't know. That's not for me to say. But it's certainly possible that it's actually not the car and that it's the track. But I don't know. Like I say, it's not for me to say. That's one, if someone from Reiza wants to pick this up and have a look at it, they're more than welcome to. Now, as well, of course, it could be completely realistic. I really don't think it is, but there's the possibility that I've never driven this car, I'm never going to drive this car. It might have been how it was. I would be amazed if the might of a Works BMW team would create a car that was so difficult to drive, especially for an endurance event. But you have to be open to that possibility as well. So, long story short, you got to baby this car, and you got to be in its current state at least, and you got to drive it extremely mindfully. And it's one of those cars where you got to be in the mood for it. I don't find it it isn't a rewarding car to drive for me personally. However, I believe it would suit some people. Some people might enjoy that sort of thing, and also as well, someone else might drive it and not have the same experience. So it's still worth a go, of course, but it isn't for me at this point in time, unless it gets worked on. However, what I will say though is that if those main key issues there, those two key issues, the braking stability and the tyre use, if they get resolved, or if it's deemed that there's something to resolve and it gets resolved, this car will be right up there, because in its heart there is an extremely good, fun car in there, and I really hope that someone at Reiza can see something in the background that makes sense and can do something about it and make it what it could be, because you can feel it. It's in there, it's wanting to get out, and it's just not able to. It's trapped. So fingers crossed, something can happen. So there's one more thing, and it's not a ball busting thing at all, and we've seen this before with other cars. The brakes, especially the rears on this car, run very, very cold. Now, we can mitigate it with this car with brake ducting settings, and you'll see that when we get into the setup itself, just how far we've had to go to get it in a sensible place for normal running. I've tried it in very, very cold conditions, which was Road Atlanta in early March this year with real weather, and it was 3 degrees air temp and 8 degrees track temp, and the rear brakes were able to run within sensible ranges. But if you were in a car, say for example like the BMW M3 E46 from the Group A class, that doesn't have the ability to change the brake ducting, those brakes in those conditions will run very, very cold, and you'll find that so the consequence of that is the brake gets to, so you're at the end of the longest part, so the brakes are at their coolest in the lap. You get, and normally at the end of the fastest part of the circuit, you've generally got the biggest stop. So you're going flat out as fast as you're going to go. The brakes are as cold as they're ever going to see in the lap. You get on the brake, and the brake starts off cold, and then as it warms up, it gains efficiency, it gains bite, and then it gains braking ability. So then as you're getting further into the braking zone, your rear brakes are getting more powerful, and you're essentially moving the brake balance rearwards, and it can destabilize the car. So like I say, with this car we can mitigate it. With a different car, say the M3 E30 Group A, it could be a problem. So just something to bear in mind. The brake the brake ducting values in the setup are really quite critical in this car. So let's get into the timeline now. I think that's where we are, isn't it? Yeah, let's get into the timeline. So timeline is relatively straightforward and simplified massively, because by the time we got to a setup version that actually worked, we were on version 7 this time. It would take far too long for me to explain the 6 prior failures, so we sort of slowly rattled through different concepts, and they all had a fairly low development ceiling, and we hit upon version 7, and it was the first concept that showed promise, that made it drive like it actually was related to the Group A M3. So that was really nice, and it was nice to get to that point, because every single version up to that point, it all took a lot of time, and it was over a week had passed to even reach that point of that like seminal version 7 setup. So, but the learnings of versions 1 through to version 6, they weren't wasted. They all, once we'd learnt it, you didn't unlearn it, you know, it wasn't, so all of those learnings were then applied and went and found their way into version 7, either in direct relation or by the avoidance of something. So it was all good stuff. It wasn't wasted time, but it was a lot of time sunk into essentially something that wasn't ever used outside of reference. So once we hit version 7, I sent it to Marc and Peter, and Peter really liked version 7. It was really nice to hear him be positive about it. And as is now customary, he returned with a few tweaks of his own, and they were really good tweaks. So he achieved a nicer braking stability, but he did it through improving compliance, whereas I was trying to get braking stability through supporting the front of the car and stiffening the front of the car. Peter did it through compliance. He played a smarter game than I did, and so when I drove his version, it was like, oh, that inside front wheel starting to, I'm getting a feel for it now. I feel like I'm starting to be able to understand when it's going to go, whereas before it was a bit of a lottery. So that was really, really cool. And from Peter's setup, which is version I think 7.1p, it then became version 7.2. There was one small change just to the front bump stop, and that was it. So by this point, Marc hadn't even tried version 7 yet. He hadn't got around to it at that point. So I told him to ignore version 7 and just try what was now 7.2, because I added that extra bit of bump stop, so it went from 7.1 to 7.2. So I just told him can you just ignore 7, go straight to 7.2, and he really liked it. But he remained a little bit cautious because of the of the long runs. It was such an early point in the development of version 7 that we weren't quite sure about the long runs by that point. So he had the caveat of, yeah, I like it, but we need to make sure that the longer runs are all okay, and that also the multiple compounds behave similarly across the one setup. Because obviously it's an endurance car, you're not going to be able to change the setup of the car just because you change tyre compounds. So it was important that the setup works on all 3 compounds. So there was still work needed to be done, and as it turns out, really there was no more real changes being made. The only change I've made is I've made the diff ramps a more rounded number, and that's it. So yeah, this is by far and away the best this car has been since I picked it up. Now, in the process, I can't speak for Marc and Peter, but I know that this car has seen in this process Cavello Short, Road Atlanta, Sebring, Silverstone National, Kyalami Modern Day, and Hockenheim GP. Various conditions at various circuits as well. So there's been a lot of work and a lot of laps spent. Right. With that said, let's get into the setup. Let's see how our setup differs from the default. So, tyres, brakes and chassis. Tyre pressures can go as low as 1.40 bar. We're at 1.46 bar. It's where the car seemed happiest. And for once, Peter and I both shared the same pressure values, starting pressure values, which is unusual. Normally my starting pressures are a little bit lower because I tend to work the car harder than Peter does. And in this case, because you can't work the car very hard, you have to baby the car so much, I wasn't able to attack it like I would normally, which means that our starting pressures were actually the same this time around, which is really cool because it means at least the game is, in that respect, it's giving us a really sensible result, which I really like. If I drive more sensitively, I end up with the same result as Peter, and if I drive the way I would normally drive, I have to reduce it. And the fact that it's like that is, I just think it's really, really cool, and I think it's worthy of note as well, and worthy of praise as well, a little bit. So into the brake pressure, because of the issues we had with the braking stability, we dropped the brake pressure more than we'd normally expect to. It's gone from 90 down to 78. Or I should say, sorry, just going back a step there, the tyre pressures of the default were 1.56 bar front and rear. So we've dropped compared to the default setup by 0.1 of a bar. Right, sorry, back to brake pressure. So brake pressure has gone from 90 down to 78 just to give us as much feel and modulation as we can. Now that'll be a personal thing. If I found that if I went lower than 78, I found I actually lost modulation because I was on the brake harder for longer and I couldn't really sort of feel where the lock point was quite so well. So I ended up using less aggressive brake application, just being more delicate on the pedal itself, found it nicer. The brake balance stayed at 59% on the front, with front brake duct opening staying at 50% as well, but the rear went from 50% opening down to 20, and that was what balanced out the brakes. Now that rear duct opening you are going to need to tweak, but we'll get to that later. The front downforce stayed at 2. Unusual to see a front downforce value on these cars, but yeah, front downforce value of 2, and rear downforce value went from 6 down to 3 because it understeered like a pig at high speed. So we dropped the rear downforce basically. Yeah, right. Into the suspension. So into the suspension. Now, I've got to say, full disclosure, this is the first time I've seen the default settings and our settings side by side, and it's been quite interesting looking at them. So our caster angle went from 7 degrees on the default to 8 degrees, and that gives us a a more weighty feeling to the steering. It gave us a better feel for where the grip was at the front of the car. And you can reduce that, and you can, if it's really aggressive, if it's too aggressive on the front, then you can reduce that a little bit, and it will just feel like the front of the car doesn't quite bite as hard, really. And if you go up, it doesn't really seem to benefit you too much by going further on than 8. The car was generally over cambered, and I think the cambers are a really big thing on this car. So the front camber went from minus 3.8 degrees down to minus 2.7. That's a big old change, that. And that would have been quite a contributing factor to the braking stability of the car, especially at the front, stopping that inside front wheel from locking and snatching. It also, as well, it also helps to reduce the tyre wear as well, because it takes the pressure and load off that very inside edge, and it just helps that inside edge stay a little bit cooler. It comes at a cost potentially, but in this case I think minus 3.8 was too much anyway. And on top of that as well, the increase in caster would mean that you do generally want to reduce the camber as well a little bit, because it's just the way that caster reacts to the way that interacts with the camber. If you increase the caster, generally you want to reduce the camber a little bit. The ride height was reduced 1mm from 52 down to 51. Again, small change, but that is where we were. The spring rate stayed at 165 Newton millimeters. The bump stop went up from 0mm to 5mm. That would have helped stabilise the front of the car a little bit. So Peter's version 7.1P setup, that had 4mm of bump stop, and I increased that from 4 to 5, and it was noticeable. It gave a bit more support to the front of the car, not just at the extreme of braking, because you don't really want the car sitting on the bump stops under what you call normal conditions, but it did just help support the front of the car at the extreme of braking on the bumps. And also, when you tip the car into the corner, the outside corner tended to kind of rest and just sort of like snuggle up against the bump stop a little bit, just to help support the outer front corner a little bit, which then also allowed the front to just sort of the inside front wheel just to move a little bit more freely, because you could then run it a little bit softer. The slow bump and slow rebound are the same as what they are on the default, and the fast bump and rebound have both been reduced from 9340 down to 9070. So if we have a quick look at that, how many clicks is that? So we've got to get to 9340. So they've gone down 1 click, which isn't very much, is it? Which really tells the story there that the problem isn't really the front suspension here, because our front suspension is not much different to the default. That's not where our gains have been found. The rear's a bit more different. So again, we found the rear was a bit over cambered, not by too much, not by as much as the front was. So the rear camber's gone from minus 2.6 down to minus 2.2. The rear ride height has been increased a little bit from 72 to 74. The spring rate has gone up from 115 Newton millimeters down to 120, up to 125 Newton millimeters. And again, bump stop has gone from 0 to 5 millimeters. The slow bump has gone down from 23200 down to 22400, and the slow rebound has also gone down from 24800 down to 23200, and that would just give us a bit more squish at the back of the car when you're getting on the throttle. That very initial power application just gives us a bit more bite from the rear of the car, a bit more stability, a bit more consistency, and a bit more confidence to do exactly that, just lean on it a little bit. The fast bump has been tuned, so they went down from 9340 at the back each down to bump was 7450 and the rebound was 9070. So they've both been reduced a little bit. Now, the fast damping is something that you can only really do using telemetry. You can't really do it by feel. You can have a stab at it by feel, But really and truly, if you're going to do it, you need to use telemetry, really. And that's where Peter comes in. He's spot on at that. He's really good. I didn't get far off. I tried to do it manually. I didn't get far off, but Peter was he just gets it right. The steering lock went. Oh no, sorry. Steering lock stayed at 22 degrees, and the toe-in angle was reduced. So default has got minus 0.4 degrees. That's toe out, where the wheels are pointing outwards. And we've reduced that so they're going more straight ahead, basically. And that really helps to keep the car, the actual chassis, stable, more stable. We've found it just helps keep the rear end, the rear inside corner, in the right place. Really, that's its main. It's a weird thing actually. So normally you would use toe and angle as a means for the initial turn-in stability, and you would find that if you ran it more toe out, like the default setup is with minus 0.4 compared to ours, you would find that the initial turn-in is generally a bit more aggressive. But here, I found that making them run more straight ahead really is, it actually helps the rear out more when you're trying to get on the throttle. You can really feel the extra toe in or the extra toe out on the front of the car. When you try and get on the throttle, it just seems to make the rear a bit more nervous. I don't think it's placebo. It's how it feels, and I've seen it on a few cars now behave in that way. So I'm fairly comfortable saying that. The front anti-roll bar was reduced from 93 Newton millimeters down to 60. That would have helped. So that's a bit of compliance in there, trying to separate the connection between the left and right front wheel, allows the wheels to move more independently of each other. So that would definitely help with a snatch of a front brake, 100%. That would be quite a big factor in this, trying to get this stable. Rear toe-in angle stayed at 0.3 degrees, and the anti-roll bar was reduced from 48 Newton millimeters down to 28. So the rear spring went from 115 to 125, so that's 10 Newton millimeters, and the anti-roll bar was reduced from 48 to 28, so that's 20 Newton millimeters. So in total, we've actually reduced our rear roll stiffness by 10 Newton millimeters in total when you work out the difference. So although the spring rate's gone up, actually the car is able to roll a little bit more. Well, assuming the same leverage ratios anyway. So yeah, we've done all right there. I think we've done the changes there. I'm actually surprised that they're more subtle than actually I thought they were going to be. For the amount of work that went into it, when you see the changes there, they're actually not that much. However, there are some key changes coming up, which are probably bigger than all of those suspension changes put together. So let's get into the drivetrain and let's go and check them out. So, drivetrain. Fuel, 44 litres will see you good for half hour. It's fine. The fuel map at 1, use it if you need to, but yeah, 1 is fine. It's the fastest it's going to be in that position. Radiator opening 80% didn't change. Didn't feel the need to change it. But you're looking for a temperature, for an engine temperature in the HUD. So if you have the little rev counter HUD gauge up, it will show you the engine temperature. You're looking for a temperature of around about 110, and that's the oil temperature of the car. About 110. When you start to go above 115, you're starting to encroach into getting a bit too hot. So what happens is if you run it so that the oil's too hot, the oil gets too thin, and it doesn't hang around where it needs to hang around for long enough, and it doesn't have the properties it needs to lubricate properly anymore. So you want it around about 110. That'll see you about right. So 105, 110. If you aim for that, and you'll be spot on. Our engine braking went from 2 on the default up to 3. Just one click, nothing major. Didn't need to go to the extremes that you read about. that's not really where the problem lay, I wouldn't say. Yeah, the engine braking, we just went up to 3 just to give it just a little bit of an easier time on that rear end when you were on the downshift. So with the engine braking, think of it rather than because a bigger number on the engine braking basically means that you get less engine braking. If I could, I would suggest, or if I may, I would suggest that gets renamed to something like idle fuel flow or something like that, because the bigger number essentially means that the engine on idle will run faster. It will give you less engine braking. But yeah, something along those lines. But at the moment, it's a little bit. It's kind of accurate, but the values are inverted to what you would expect. So yeah, so a smaller number will basically mean that the rear is more, well, that the engine affects the braking or is introduced into the braking of the car more than the bigger numbers. We don't have traction control, anti-lock brakes, or automatic gears. It's a very basic car. The final drive is not adjustable in this car, but your first to sixth gears are, and you probably will want to have a look at those ratios. When you change them, the gaps are quite nice the way that they are, so make sure that you adjust each one in a uniform value, you know, so only ever go up one click. If you go up one click for first gear, make sure you go up one click for all the others as well, because otherwise you're going to throw them out of kilter, and you're going to find you get a really slow pickup at one point and a really quick pickup the next. So yeah, you can do the first to sixth gears for the bigger circuits. If you were to go to, say, like Le Mans, you might want to go to a smaller number. So a smaller number will make the car faster top speed but slower 0 to 60. A bigger number will give you a slower top speed and a faster 0 to 60, assuming good traction, of course. Right, now next bit, the diff. This was the biggest change, and again, the numbers don't look that different, but they really are. It's a big difference. So clutch LSD is on. That's the thing you can't change because it's a clutch LSD, so you can't get out of that. But the preload went up from 120 to 180 Newton meters. The clutches went from 6 to 8, and the power ramp went from 50 to 70, and the coast ramp went from 45 to 70. So, what does that mean? Well, preload is a constant force that acts on the diff internals. So if you have it at 0, they're essentially free running until the clutches engage. If you have it set really, really high, then it's just a constant force that's constantly engaging the clutches at all times. So you can go up to about, I think it's 500 is the maximum. You're not going to use 500, but so we went up a little bit from 120 to 180. Now the clutches is a good thing. So the clutches are like a multiplier, if you like. So you got 2, 4, 6, and 8, and 10. So we've gone up one level on the clutches, and it basically just means that when the diff locks, it locks more aggressively. Basically, it's got a sharper bite to it. But with this car, you also then have the ramp options. But what are the ramp options? Well, the diff internals have these little ramps, and you've got the diff that runs. So, oh crikey, it's so difficult to explain. You probably need to watch a video really on it. But when you engage torque on the diff internals, the diff gears operate within what's called within a cage, and that cage has got ramps in it, and then when the internals shift and rotate inside it, these ramps will dictate how much they open or not. So you're basically you're forcing the diff internals into an ever decreasing gap, and the ramp angle is the angle of that ever decreasing gap. So if you have a low degree angle it basically means that it works its way in there and it's forcing those plates apart up against the clutches a lot easier. It's got a much easier task to force those cages apart and force the clutches in to then engage the clutches. Whereas if you've got a much higher angle, much steeper angle, it can't force them apart as easily. So if it's really shallow, you've got something in there and they open up. If you've got it really, really aggressively angled, it goes up against it, but it can't really force them apart. It just kind of like butts up against them more. So that's why the shallower angle is the more aggressive setting. So what we did, we increased the clutches so that when it engaged, it was more aggressive, but we made it so that it didn't engage as aggressively through the ramps. So we made the ramps a lot kinder, but we made it so that when it did engage, we did get drive from both wheels a lot more. And the same with the coast as well. It just meant that the rear was, it engaged in a kinder way. So six clutches and a lower ramp angle was actually engaging more aggressively and more harshly and in a way that the car didn't like. Whereas when we went from 8 and then a steeper ramp angle, yeah, you got more clutches, but it engaged in a much more friendly way that the car was able to cope with. And it was a really nice change, and it was that unlocked version 7. Up until that point, we were chasing it. Well, I was chasing around on suspension and trying to do it all on that. That unlocked everything because it made it kinder on the brakes, it made it kinder on the throttle, and it made it feel like it was related to the Group A E30 M3 for the first time. That was what made it feel like it was a distant relation. Still with a few issues, but you could feel it, and it was like, brilliant. I'm starting to feel where this car is now. So yeah, that was really cool. Anyway, right, so that's the setup. That's how it differs from the default. But this is one of those cars where the setup you see on the screen is likely not going to always be the setup that you use on all circuits. This is not going to be a universal setup. I don't think this car will ever have a universal setup until or unless Reiza can do something about the issues we mentioned before. So likelihood is you're going to want to change a few bits and pieces, but what are you going to want to change and how are you going to want to change them? Well, let's get into that now, shall we? Really and truly, it could be anything in this setup sheet that you're going to want to change. So rather than bingo calling one particular thing, they're all fairly powerful adjustments, really. So tyre pressures, you're going to want to make sure that they're under control and they're in sensible places. So you're going to find that you're happy in a certain place, and if you go softer, you're going to find that you struggle to keep the middle of the tyre where it needs to be. You can go too far with these tyres. So for us, 1.46 was nice. It put you in a place where you could drive the car sensibly, the way it wanted to be driven. Not necessarily the way you want to drive it, but the way it needs to be driven. If you're kinder than that, again, you might want to go up a little bit. If you're more aggressive than that, you're screwed. You're not going to get anything out of this car. So really and truly, unless you're wanting to drive it more sensitively than what this is for, you're going to struggle with this car. You can increase the front a little bit if you want to make it a bit smoother, but generally speaking, I would say you probably want to leave them at 1.45, 1.46ish. The brake pressure will be down to your taste. I mentioned earlier that when I tried it lower, I actually felt like I lost modulation because I found that I was on the brake pedal more harshly, and I sort of lost feel for where the braking point was, where the lock point was. I found that running it at a higher pressure which, believe it or not, 78 was a higher pressure. But that running it at a higher pressure allowed me to rest my foot more on the brake rather than really press on it, and then I could just had a bit more sensitivity in the way I could modulate it. The brake bias, now this is one that you probably are going to want. So you're going to want to map a button on your steering wheel for this car for the brake bias. So when you start a run, you might find that the early laps require a more rearward brake bias, and then in the first lap and a half, 2-3 laps, you might find you just want to move the brake bias forwards a click, maybe every half lap or so, as everything warms up. Yeah, just be wary of that. You can't just leave the brake bias where it is. You might need to tweak it with. So if it's the start of a run, you then might need to just bring it forwards a little bit, and then when you come in the pits and change your tyres, you might just want to bring it back a few clicks as well. I found about 3% is about the shift you need from cold to running temperatures. But if you run it forwards from the start, you're at risk of snatching that inside front wheel again. And if you snatch the inside front wheel again, you've got no anti-lock brakes. You will ruin that front tyre, and you're carrying that damage all the way through until that tyre is changed again. So you do need to bring it back. You just need to make sure that you then incrementally bring it forwards to suit the circuit and the conditions that you're on at the time. The duct opening, you're going to want to change this again, but it's relatively simple. At the fastest, so do a few laps, get everything warmed up. At the end of the longest straight, you'll probably find that the brakes are at their coolest. But wherever on the circuit the brakes are at their coolest, you want them to be around about 180 to 190 degrees before you hit the brakes. If you do that, then they'll still be just about in the green, but as cool as they can be within that green section. If you go below that, you're in a bit of trouble. You can be a little bit above it, no problem at all. But if you start seeing temperatures climb, then you might just want to open the brake ducts a little bit more. But that's what you're looking for. End of straight, coolest point, around about 180, 190 degrees. And that will see you about right by that rule. Front downforce we didn't even touch, and the rear downforce was quite sensitive and quite effective. If you want a bit more stability, go up on the downforce. If you want a bit more rotation on the faster stuff, drop it down by a click. But it is quite sensitive, so do be wary of that. And also don't forget as well, if you reduce the downforce or increase the downforce, your rake is going to be adjusted as well, so just be wary of that as well with your ride heights. On the suspension caster angle, if you increase it, you essentially make the steering heavier. I can't imagine you going much beyond 8 degrees. You can go a lot further than 8, but I can't see you using much more than 8. It does weird things beyond that, really. Maybe 8.5 or so, but certainly beyond that you're getting into weird territory. Camber angles, critical on this car. 2.7 was nice, especially mixed with the 8-degree caster. You're going to want to look at that. You may, because tyres are so critical and the way that they wear, you may want to consider some asymmetric setups on some circuits, because you do really need to look after the tyres more than any other car I've ever driven. The front ride height's quite sensitive, hence the 1mm difference. It's only a small difference, but it's a difference. So if you want a bit more aggressive, you can lower it only a little bit. I think it only goes down to 50. You can lower it if you want a bit more smooth. If you want to smooth the front end out a little bit, you can raise it if you want to. Spring rate's a bit weird. So I personally would probably leave it where it is on the front. It's the spring rate we kept at 165. Now, when I was running it in the higher ranges, it wasn't beneficial because it took away compliance from the front end of the car, and it meant that the front end then became prone to snatching that inside front wheel on the brakes, and it really accentuated the problems that the car has got. 165 was a really nice place to have it, and that was where the default setup got it absolutely bang on. The bump stops certainly helped, and you won't want to go much more than 5, I wouldn't have thought, because if you go more than 5, they'll be used, then the car will rest on the bump stops far too much. So You may even want to go lower than 5. Just depends how you're feeling the compliance issues. But certainly, if you were struggling with the front corner, with the front wheel snatching and locking, you could reduce it a little bit on the bump stop, and that would probably help you out a little bit. The bump and rebound, slow bump and rebound, I would probably. It's tricky again, because again, if you go up on that, you lose a bit of compliance. If you go down on that, that's not really under control. Really, that slow bump and rebound is kind of where it needs to be for that spring rate. Likewise, the fast bump and rebound is kind of ideal for that spring rate, and I don't see you really wanting to change that too much. If you're looking for stability, I would probably suggest you look for it at the back of the car. Likewise, I wouldn't look for stability using the front anti-roll bar either, because again, if you increase the front roll bar, you're gonna introduce a connection between the left and the right wheel, and you're going to lose a bit of compliance. You got to make sure that those front tyres can grip. You can't interrupt that, because if you interrupt that, you wreck them in a heartbeat, and it ruins your entire run. So you've really got to make sure that those inside front wheels have got all the independence they need to do the jobs they've got to do. Now on the rear of the car, again, camber angle is quite critical. Again, you may want to consider some asymmetric settings here, and that will help you, I think, on certain circuits. The ride height's quite handy. If you change the downforce level, if you increase the downforce, you might want to increase your ride height. If you reduce your downforce, you might want to reduce your ride heights a little bit, just to keep the rake of the car at the higher speeds where it needs to be. Peter did a lot of work on the rake, so where it is now is where it does sit nicely and where it kind of needs to be, it seems. The spring rate, so what we did, we took the roll stiffness out from the anti-roll bar, which is what the default. So the default setup was getting roll stiffness, and roll stiffness is, as the name suggests, it's the stiffness that's required to roll the car, or sorry, it's the stiffness that's resisting the roll of the car, I should say more accurately. So you can do that two ways. You can have a really stiff spring, main spring, and a soft roll bar that add up to be X number, or you can have a really stiff roll bar and a soft spring, and they add up to the same roll stiffness. But the anti-roll bar doesn't support the car when you're getting on the throttle. So when the weight's just going backwards equally, the anti-roll bar has no effect, and if you've got a stiff roll bar and a soft spring, then the rear of the car can squat, which then gives you a bit of extra grip, yes, but can also then make the front lift and cause problems. So, and also when you're trying to get on the throttle whilst you're in a turn, a stiff anti-roll bar tends to help unload the inside wheel, which means that it can spin up easier, and then that can cause you traction loss and problems, and generally dents, I find, and a little bit of gravel rash. So we've gone the other way to the default setup. So the default setup preferred to have a stiffer roll bar and a softer spring. We've gone a stiffer spring and a softer roll bar. So we've got a bit of extra support in the rear of the car. The rear of the car doesn't squat as much, no, but the anti-roll bar is a lot weaker, and it allows the inside wheel to do what it's got to do to find the grip that it's trying to find without being interrupted by the outside wheel being loaded up. It seems to prefer it that way. The bump stop, again, it was less critical on the rear, but it did help. It just helped sort of stabilise the car a little bit on the bumps, and it made it feel a bit nicer over the curbs as well. The rear damping was generally run a little bit softer, so we found that, again, that sort of helped with the rear spring rate increase. Having the rear damping a little bit softer just allowed it. So actually, to be fair, and that damping also matched that spring rate better as well. So the default setup had a softer spring and stiffer damping. It was over damped at the back of the car. I'm not actually that surprised that it had traction issues. This damping far better matches even the stiffer spring rate, even though the damping is softer. And again, Peter put a lot of work into that, which is really, really cool. Now, the fast damping, it's kind of matched to the spring rate. So I wouldn't mess around with that unless you really, really want to get into it. I wouldn't worry about doing anything with the fast damping. The toe angle actually was quite effective. If you want a bit more stability, you can go up. If you're happy with the rear of the car or it feels a bit too locked in, you can go down a little bit and that'll be fine. The anti-roll bar, same deal really. If you want, if the back of the car feels a bit too locked in, you can go up a little bit on the roll bar, but I wouldn't go too far because then you introduce it makes it harder to get on the throttle reliably. So yeah, I don't think you can go softer than 28. I think 28 is the softest you can go. Oh no, you can go to, yeah. So we've got one more rate below that, so you can soften it one more click if you want to. That'll give you a bit more stability, maybe a bit more traction. But yeah, it was nice where it is. Just depends on what you're looking for, really. And in the drivetrain, so as I mentioned earlier, the ratios you can change, but just make sure you change them all in a universal way, top to bottom. The engine braking, I don't really subscribe to that being the fix that I read about. It does have an effect. Don't get me wrong, and it does have a similar effect to what people say it does. In that, if you run it really, really high, then the rear of the car becomes more stable. But I find that while it's sort of true, it almost to me feels like it makes the front of the car run on a little bit too far, a bit too easily. Yeah, it's a tricky one, but it'll be one of those personal taste ones. I found, and so did Peter, and so did Mark. We all found 3 was about right, and it goes up to, I think it goes up to 10. I think. Yeah, it goes up to 10. So we're well and truly into the lower ranges, in the more aggressive range. Yeah, again, personal taste. It's I would say that's akin to the steering lock angle, really. If you want a bit more aggressive on the steering, then you can increase the steering lock value. Well, I would say that's similar to that. If you want it a bit more aggressive, reduce it. If you want the engine braking to be a bit less aggressive, you can increase it. So now onto the clutches, power ramps, and preload of the diff. Now, I personally in the dry wouldn't change this. I would leave this alone. But if you find that the rear of the car is locking up in the entry phase, then you can increase the coast ramp a little bit. You could also reduce the clutches so it locks less aggressively, because like I say, the clutches is like a multiplier, so you can do that if you want to. You can reduce the clutches a little bit. That'll, generally speaking, so the clutches will cover both power and coast phases, as will the preload. The preload is a constant. The clutches are engaged at the point when the locking happens. The power ramp only happens when you're on the throttle, and the coast ramp only applies when you're off the throttle. Would I change it? I probably wouldn't unless it was wet, and even then it would be the last thing I would change. Which leads me nicely into what I would change for the wet. So if it was wet, I would soften the rear mainly. I would probably go down on the spring, I'd go down on the damping, and I'd probably try and reduce the roll bar if I had any more to go. Possibly increase the towing angle a little bit. If that wasn't enough, only then would I consider probably reducing the clutches down to 6 or possibly 4. Probably only 6. That's probably as far as I would go. Now, there's a bigger subject here than just what you see on the screen. So if we come out of this screen, our tyre choice, soft, medium, hard, slick. How do you know which one to use and when? So rather than trying to give you temperature ranges, which differ from car to car, driving style to driving style, and tyre pressures and all sorts, I think it's probably best if I give you the signs to look out for. So I've got it written down here, and I tried to word it carefully, so I'm going to read it out. So if you get a tyre temperature build-up that continues to escalate into the yellow on the HUD, even if you're driving within sensible slip and very sensible slide, i.e. you don't want to be sliding. If you're sliding, it's not going to matter what tyre you're on. You need to bring it back in. You need to rein yourself back in. But if you're driving sensibly with minimal slip and very, very little, only occasional accidental slide, then you need to consider going to a harder compound, because the tyres are just not cutting it. They're not able to cope with the work that's being asked of them. But what does that feel like? So it's not necessarily just the colour of the HUD. So when they're too hot, they'll reach a stage where they never really bite. They feel a bit gummy, and so the feeling of grip doesn't ramp up as much. It's sort of more soft and flat curve, if you like, and they never really bite. And then when they let go, they let go a little bit earlier, and in a way that's very, very difficult to catch. And this can happen before it sees the yellow on the HUD. So you need to be really, really mindful. You've got to do it by feel. And there may be something for Reiza to look at here, because as I say, the hards, you shouldn't be able to get to that point on the hards, especially when the track temperature was 43 degrees. I think there might be something going on there. So this part of this video might well be obsolete if they make any changes. But for now, at least, keep an eye out for an escalation in temperatures that you can't really do anything about. Just normal car behavior is escalating these temperatures out of control, and you can't do anything about it. And then if it reaches that gummy, slippy stage where they never really bite and the grip doesn't really ramp up in your hands, you don't feel it through the wheel, there's a good chance you probably need to consider going up a compound. But what happens if you need to go down a compound? Well, that's much simpler. Basically, if you can't get temperature in the tyres, if you can't get those tyres into the green on the HUD, you want to go softer. That one's much, much easier. So that's a really long video, isn't it? If you followed me all the way through to this point, well done, congratulations. If you got this far and you still want to give this car a try, credit to you. I don't, yeah, you've done well, because it's a very difficult car to like. But as I said earlier, it feels like there's a really good car in there. It's bursting to get out, but it's caged and it can't quite. It's got some limitations that you can't do anything about. So I hope those limitations will be lifted, and then this car at that point will just burst out, and you will have a fantastic time driving it, and so will I, because I can feel it's there. Right, so let's get into what's next, shall we? What a sucker I am. I had a very long chat with Marc, and he he suggested that the BMW GT3 Gen2 is a little bit behind its brothers and sisters in the class. So I gave it a quick run, and it was indeed about 1.5 seconds elapsed slower around Jerez 88 than the Corvette was in its default setup form. Didn't feel bad, to be fair, but it was behind by quite a way. So, but we both felt it needed a bit of a leg up. And in continuation of the BMW theme we've had recently, let's see if we can redeem the BMW badge a little bit, and let's see what we can do with this car. Let's see if we can bring this car back to competitive order against its brothers and sisters, and let's go and have some fun doing it. Now, when I drove it, it didn't seem to have the same problems as the GTR version, which is really great to hear. It's got some characteristics which are similar, like the on power stability. So when I ran it at TC0 and ABS0, just to get a feel for it in its rawest state, I wouldn't race it in that condition, but to get a feel for it in its rawest state, yeah, it was a good way of testing out roughly where the car is. And yeah, I think we've got a good chance of making this car good. So this is what we're going to do. This is what we're going to work on next. We're going to go for the BMW M4 GT3 from the GT3 Gen2 class. Right. Well, thank you for watching. Thank you for getting this far if you have. Thank you for supporting. In the meantime, I'll leave you with the setup sheets and rates and units for the E46 GTR. And until the next time, we'll see you later.